Hello and welcome to State Matters. I'm your host, Matt Muratore. Today, we will be discussing offshore renewable energy, ocean planning, climate change, and coastal resilience, port and harbor planning, and much more. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Carlisle, Director of the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. Bruce, thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate that. So we always start off with our guests just telling us a little bit who they are. I did a little bit of an intro here, but tell us who you are.
Right,
Give us
yes.
your background.
Bruce Carlisle, I'm the Director of the State's Office of Coastal Zone Management. I've been in that position for several years and spent a good portion of my career there, formerly as Assistant Director, and I've held other positions. I managed the state's wetland restoration program, done a lot of work on water quality and habitat protection and things like that.
So how did you get into this?
My passion really is the coast.
Okay.
I grew up with family on the Cape and islands, and
Where'd you grow up on the Cape?
Family in Orleans.
Okay.
Right.
Oh, yeah,
I grew up out in the Berkshires in Massachusetts,
Okay.
southern up in northern Connecticut.
Two great tourist areas in the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. You're the best of both worlds.
Yeah, yeah, and I did a graduate program at Tufts University,
Okay.
environmental policy program, and in that program was had the flexibility to really sort of tailor to your interests, and so was able to really put together a really sort of unique graduate program with a focus on ocean and coastal policy and environmental management.
And where'd you do your undergrad?
So my undergrad was also at Tufts,
Okay,
and actually the School Museum of Fine Arts. So I did a double bachelor degree, so a BA and a BFA in 5 years. So it was it was a good experience.
And how many years have you been with the state now?
I've been with the state about 15 plus years.
Okay. In this same department?
Yes, with CZM.
Okay, cool. So tell the folks that are watching how the structure works. So this is under Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, correct?
Right.
So where do you folks
Yeah, so
fall?
we actually sit right within the Secretary's office.
Okay.
And it might be helpful for your viewers to sort of understand a little bit about state coastal programs. And I think the important point here is that it's really a federal-state partnership. And so in 1972, Congress recognized that our coastal areas really needed enhanced management, enhanced coordination, and passed the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, which allows states to put together these unique coastal programs, but offers them flexibility in where it sits in government organization and kind of how it's structured and what its priorities, provided it meets a set of national interests and national priorities. We were one of the first states in the nation with an approved program. 1978, we were federally approved. And we get a grant every year from the federal government. We match it with state funds, and really that's the sort of the basis of that.
How much is that grant every year?
It fluctuates, and it's frankly it's been stagnant with federal funding. It's about $2 million, give or take, 1.5 to 2, and we do our best to augment that by chasing other competitive grants. And of course, we've had the great support of the governor and the secretary, and we'll talk about some of our other grant programs and some of our other financial resources.
So what are some of the priorities you folks have?
Right. So we, like other coastal programs, we work on a suite of issues that your viewers and folks in coastal communities are going to be aware of. Water quality, habitat protection, conservation, port and harbor planning and management, energy, ocean-based energy, other projects like that. Our priorities for the last few years and moving forward into the next couple of years are really three. The first one is climate change and increasing resilience of our coastal communities for our coastal stakeholders, for our residents, for our businesses, for our tourists. So that's a really, really, really important issue, and we'll probably talk more about that. Number two is we've been spending a lot of time, and we'll continue to spend a lot of time, supporting the responsible development of offshore wind energy. It's going to be a big part of our renewable, sustainable energy portfolio. We've seen that starting to move, and we can talk more about some of the history of that and what kind of the next steps are. And then the next big one, our next priority, is protecting, conserving, restoring coastal habitats and our focus is on salt marshes. So these are really, really productive, unique coastal estuarine systems. They have some of the highest, ecosystem and primary productivity values, serve as refuge for many of our commercial and recreational fisheries as habitat. They're also, at threat from rising seas. So this is a really important issue. So we'll be doing a lot of work on tidal and salt marshes going forward.
Let's talk about the wind, offshore wind, because I think just recently it was announced that the project's going to move forward off the vineyard. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. As you mentioned, a couple weeks ago on May 23rd, the governor announced the results of the first procurement. The procurement was required under the Energy Diversity Act that the legislature passed and the governor signed, which requires the Commonwealth to procure over a period of time 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind. Back a few weeks ago, the governor's announcement was that Vineyard Wind, one of the 3 developer projects that were submitted for the procurement, was selected based upon cost effectiveness for our ratepayers in the Commonwealth and on other aspects of the project to enter into contract negotiations with utilities. So those negotiations are underway, and we expect the outcomes of those soon. When we talk about offshore wind, I think we also have to provide some context. So the governor's announcement was a really, really, really important milestone in both the legislative process, but it goes back before that. It really dates back to when we started in earnest on offshore wind on the whole siting process in 2009. So what we're talking about is areas in federal waters on the outer continental shelf. Managed by the federal government. It's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, so they've got primary jurisdiction. The state's got involvement though in this. The transmission cables are going to have to cross state waters, but also the coastal programs have a sort of unique, under the Coastal Zone Management Act, unique oversight over projects in or affecting our coastal resources. And certainly there's coastal uses, commercial and recreational fishing, and some of our marine life that they pass between state and federal waters. They don't know if they're in state or federal waters. The fishermen do, but the whales don't.
Right.
So that began in 2009 with the formation of an intergovernmental task force. So my office, I represent, along with a couple other of my colleagues from Division of Marine Fisheries and the Clean Energy Center, we represent the Secretary's office and the Commonwealth on the task force. And that provides an opportunity for the federal government to hear the concerns, to gather information, to get data from the Commonwealth and from our state and local entities. So that's a big piece of it. So that's gone through a siting process where we started with a big geographic area. The federal government puts out a call to find out if there's development interest, and they also find out where there are areas that are really important to commercial fishing, are really important for marine life and marine habitats. And we start to whittle away to try to find the best areas. And that sort of goes over a sort of sequential process, and then they do an area identification, and then ultimately they get to a competitive auction where they auction off some areas. So our first auction was in 2015. We had 4 areas, 2 were leased, okay, so that was the Vineyard Wind, and the other one is Bay State Wind. There's an area just to the east, which is the Rhode Island and Massachusetts wind energy area, which is auctioned to Deepwater Wind. Around the same time that the governor announced the results of the Commonwealth's procurement, Rhode Island announced and Connecticut announced results of their own procurements. So Deepwater Wind, which is another offshore wind developer, and the developer of the first project in the Northeast, which is the Block Island Wind Farm. It's the Pilot Communities project down in Rhode Island. So Deepwater did get the same thing, selected for contract negotiations for 400 megawatts for Rhode Island and 20 for Connecticut. So, I mean, the takeaway here is with these procurements and the energy contracts, these projects now are real. They have now the financial assurances that they can move forward. And there will be procurements to come. So I mentioned the Energy Diversity Act calls for 1,600, so 800 for Vineyard Wind, and we expect a future procurement to happen coming up. The other thing I would say is that a really important thing for the Commonwealth is the task force is great, but it's only governmental entities. So it's elected officials and it's state and federal agencies, some of our local elected officials. We're missing key stakeholders. So the Commonwealth stood up 2 working groups, a fisheries working group on offshore wind and a habitat working group on offshore wind. We co-lead that, my office does, with Division of Marine Fisheries and the Clean Energy Center. Just this past Monday, we're down in New Bedford meeting with our fisheries working group, working on issues surrounding, safe navigation and passage through the wind farms, siting issues, making sure that, transmission corridors are properly sited, that these cables are going to be buried, so they're not going to interfere with either mobile or fixed gear, a whole range of issues. So in a lot of ways, the announcement was an important milestone, but we still got some work to do. There's a whole suite of environmental review and permits coming up, but we look forward to continuing to advance these really, really important projects.
When do you think the work will actually start taking place?
I think folks can probably expect 2021, 2022, maybe some early work in 2020. It really sort of depends, but that's probably the sweet spot, and then moving forward from there.
Didn't all this start when Ted Kennedy was alive?
Well, there was the Cape Wind project, and even before that.
Even before that.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen really,
a couple of decades.
This might be a good transition to kind of ocean management and ocean planning.
Yeah.
But over the past 2 decades, really, we've seen a heightened interest in using ocean space for new uses, which we haven't in the past, whether it's a wind energy or a tidal energy project, or liquefied natural gas terminal, deep water ports, pipelines, not just the cables for renewable energy, but transatlantic, fiber optic cables, things like that. People looking to do beach nourishment and to use sand resources, from the ocean areas. So while this was sort of going on and getting up to the sort of early to mid 2005, 2006 timeframe, the Commonwealth said, hold on a second, there's a lot going on. At the same time, we're seeing this increasingly busy space. We're starting to see, have some real concerns about the health of our marine systems. Commercial fish stocks and depletions there, harmful algal blooms, shellfish bed and swimming beach closures, and just some real concern about the state and the welfare of our ocean environment. So back in 2003, 2004, then Governor Romney formed a task force. Had a whole bunch of different stakeholders, legislators, industry, private sector, conservation folks together, and said, I want you guys to make some recommendations to the Commonwealth on how we can better manage and govern our ocean resources. And so the task force came back with a number of recommendations.
Is that the Ocean Advisory Commission?
This is before that. So
before
this is
that.
So this is how we get there.
Okay.
Task force came back, and they had a suite, like maybe a dozen recommendations. Their number one, their keystone recommendation was that the state should pass legislation requiring proactive, comprehensive ocean planning. And they wanted to do that through the legislative process because they wanted there to be buy-in. They wanted this to be not just an executive order or something we do under our agency authorities. We wanted this to be, and the task force wanted this to be, more of an organic process. So it took some years from the task force findings, but in 2008, the legislature passed the Oceans Act. The Oceans Act requires the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs to develop a comprehensive integrated ocean plan. And it created 2 advisory bodies, the Ocean Advisory Commission, which you sit on with 5 other of your colleagues. The Ocean Advisory Commission has 9 other representatives, from different of our coastal regions. It's got representatives from the environmental community, from the commercial fishing community, and from the renewable energy community. as well as myself and my colleague David Pierce, Director of Marine Fisheries. So the Ocean Advisory Commission has been really, really important, offers guidance and input and feedback to my office and to the Secretary as we develop the ocean plan and as we implement the ocean plan and as we look to an update. So the first ocean plan was released in 2009. We did a really comprehensive update and amendment in 2015, and then in 2020 we'll be rolling up our sleeves and doing that again. So real quickly, what the ocean plan does is it identifies really important marine habitat, marine life, ecosystem concerns, and at the same time identifies areas that are really important to sustainable marine water dependent uses. What are the really important areas for commercial fishing? What are the high areas of recreational boating? What are the high areas of navigation and shipping and commerce? And it directs new projects away from these areas. So there's essentially a presumption that there's a better area for you. Now they can overcome that presumption, but we prefer that they not go locate something in a critical habitat area or a really important area that's important for our commercial fishermen. Yeah. So it really creates a blueprint. It's the first in the nation ocean plan. It's been modeled now. We were sort of doing it at the same time with our peers down in Rhode Island. We sort of did that sort of in parallel. They've got their ocean special area management plan. And there's now regional plans for the Northeast, for the North Atlantic, and the Mid-Atlantic region. So we sort of set the path on that one, basically saying, you know what, this first come, first serve, or this sort of reactive governance, it's not the way to go. We don't do that on the land, right? We're very thoughtful, land use planning and zoning and all that type of stuff. People don't like when you talk about ocean zoning, but I don't think what we're talking about is ocean zoning. We're talking about better decision making and using best available science to make our decisions.
And it's a great advisory commission that I'm on, and it's actually the first commission I was actually appointed to. Yeah. So I was really proud of that.
Well, we appreciate your participation.
Yeah. It's great. It's
very
great.
much do.
You guys do some great work there. You brought up climate change, so let's talk about that first. I know there's always debate whether climate change is real or not, but for the sake of argument, it's real. We have a nuclear power plant here in Plymouth. So there's always been debate over the years of the rising water and the storage of the spent fuel rods and the dry cask storage, and should they be close to the ocean or further away, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about the climate change and what you do?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go with the scientific community on this one. Consensus is that climate change is real. Right. The other thing is, I think we almost don't need to do that, and we go at this through really providing assistance to our coastal cities and towns. So in Massachusetts, like other New England states, as you know, our local governments have a lot of responsibilities. We're home rule. So they make a lot of decisions at the local level. And we consider our coastal cities and towns to be really, our primary constituents, our primary clients. A lot of folks on the planning board, in the conservation commissions, and other departments, they're busy just like we are. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to provide them with the best tools, the best information, fact sheets, website resources, and others, and financial resources, and I'll get to that, to help meet them where they are in improving their coastal resiliency to their communities and to their residents. So if we talk about climate change, let's talk about sea level rise. So you can say climate change is or isn't real. We've got long-term tide gauge records across the nation, across the globe. We're now measuring, and we have been for decades through satellites, altimetry, the sea level. The sea level is rising. Right. So, you can call it what you want to call it, but it's rising. Right. So we've seen about a foot of sea level rise in the past 100 years. And with ocean warming, you get thermal expansion. You get the melting with not only warmer waters, but warmer temperatures. You get ice sheet melt. You get changes in regional circulation, and that compounded with what's already happening with our land our land base, vertical land movement, we're going to see those sea level rise rates accelerate. So,
Do you think that happened this past March with all these bad storms?
right. So let's get to that. Let
Yeah.
me just make the point that I think by 2100 we could see anywhere from 3 to 4 to 7 feet of sea level rise, depending
Wow,
upon
that much. Wow.
Yeah, and it's really driven by our emissions, and we'll talk about that too. But they go hand in hand. So we need to be preparing for a changing climate and sea level rise. We also need to be absolutely addressing our greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not really, we do a little work on offshore wind and some other stuff. It's not in our, coastal zone management program area, but all the work that the Commonwealth is doing, that our secretary and our agencies are doing, and the governor and the legislature has been doing, Massachusetts is absolutely a leader on, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So we can talk more about that. Yeah, the coastal storms.
And I bring up those 3 storms in March is because we're doing, DCR is doing a major project on our waterfront here in Plymouth. Originally, they were going to put in $2 million to renovate, and they were going to start in May. Well, after those storms, they came down and evaluate the waterfront where DCR owns the property, and there was so much damage from the seawalls and the erosion there, they had to put another $1 million into trying to build it all back up.
Yeah.
So those 3 storms, and then when we had to meet with some neighbors on the coast who have homes right on the land. And they lost, in some cases, 20, 30 feet in those 3 storms, whereas prior was like a foot a year.
Yeah.
So it is happening a lot faster.
It is happening, and I think with the coastal storms, we go through these sort of cycles, and there is no doubt that this past winter was one of those really bad cycles. I think there's a couple things to talk about in coastal storms. There's our tropical storms, our hurricanes and our tropical depressions that originate down in the southern hemisphere, create this cyclone and essentially moves pretty quickly up, makes landfall, and then kind of moves along. So 24-hour, maybe a little bit more event, kind of quicken out. Those are bad. We can get a significant amount of storm surge, of waves, of precipitation. But people forget the impact of our extratropical storms, the nor'easters. And what they do is they form up in the Atlantic Basin, Massachusetts bays, Gulf of Maine, and sit out there. And they sit out there for several different tidal cycles. And when you're sitting out there for several tidal cycles, generating those wind-driven waves over those high tides, you're going to get some serious impact. And what happens is when they sit out there, your tidal, you can't drain as well, so your next tide's even stronger, and your erosion is just it's just taking a beating. So. In many ways, while they might not be as intense as our tropical storms and our hurricanes, these nor'easters are just as bad. Folks paying attention will know that in the series of March nor'easters that we had, and we had these successive, I think it was 3 or 4 in March, one in January, big one, but one of the ones in, I believe in March, set or tied or just eked out a new high water level at the Boston tide gauge. So that's a nor'easter. That's not even a tropical storm. Anyway, so as getting back to CZM's role, we do a lot of work, kind of before, pre-storm, during storm, and after storm. So during storm, we are in the Emergency Operations Center in Framingham, what they call the bunker. We help staff a desk there. And we've got a storm damage assessment team that's made up of not only CZM folks and other state agencies, but folks out in local government. A lot of cities and towns have staff that participate, and we've got coverage for the entire coast. They go out depending upon what kind of storm we're going to get, where we're going to anticipate the impacts, either during the storm or as soon as it's safe to go out after, and get those immediate reports into the bunker. We help MEMA and the Federal Emergency Management Act and cities and towns with post-storm damage assessments and really sort of keep track of that. So that's what we do during an event. Sort of between and before an event, we're all about trying to support towns to increase resiliency. We provide technical decision support tools, website resources, workshops. So for example, we've got maps showing where sea level rise areas are going to be. where hurricane inundation areas are going to be, where our FEMA mapped, 100-year base flood is. And we've got that on an online viewer, and we show different, community assets, public infrastructure, everything from police and fire and hospitals to, pump stations for wastewater treatment plants or drinking water supplies, so that communities can, have that information and understand, where they may be at risk. We show communities and have a long-term project with USGS, the Woods Hole Science Center, on shoreline change. Long-term and short-term erosion rates. Where are the hot spots? Where are the areas of shoreline change that we need to pay attention to? So those are decision support tools that we provide out, not just to communities, but to engineering firms, the private sector, consulting firms, and other folks. And then I talked about financial assistance, and we are so pleased to have the support of the Governor's Office of the Secretary for a Coastal Resilience Grant Program. So we've been running this since 2015. We've issued about $9 million in state funds through a competitive grants program, matched by about $4 million in local contributions, 67 projects, 40 different cities and towns.
In the last 3 years?
Yeah, last 4 years. Yeah, 4 years. Yep.
Wow.
And we are, as we speak right now, reviewing our current round. This will probably be our largest single funding round to date. So we've been about 2 million, a little bit more, 2.5.
Is Plymouth on that list?
Yeah, I can't tell you.
Or any of the coastal towns? Okay.
You guys,
Thought I could get it out of you.
Plymouth has been, Plymouth and your district, Sandwich and others have been, really active, submit very competitive proposals. I want to just mention that, on the grants program, we've tailored this by design to be really, really flexible. We didn't want to say it's sort of one way, we want to say we'll meet the communities where the communities are. What are your needs? Do you need to do a comprehensive vulnerability assessment? Do you need to do planning in a certain district or a neighborhood? Are there areas that you've already identified where you want to do some retrofits or redesigns or reconstruction? Are there areas where you want to do kind of nature-based solutions? Could we do some beach nourishment? Could we do some dune restoration? Could we put in some fringing salt marsh to enhance the natural benefits that our systems can provide? So it's been a really, really, really popular, really effective program. We look forward to the next round and continuing that good work.
That's great.
Yeah.
Listen, we got 30 seconds left.
Okay.
Tell us quickly, any sort of program areas or efforts that our viewers should be aware of for the upcoming summer?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, it's the summer season. Everybody wants to get out, right? So a couple things I'd mention. Number one is we've got this really great tool. It's called Coast Guide Online. We've got over 1,800 public access sites, from big beaches to small little rights of way and landings and boat ramps. So you can just Google Massachusetts Coast Guide Online. You can do it right there on your cell phone. You can find where you want to go for the day. The other thing I'd remind folks is, for our boating community, it is the boating season, so look out for whales, look out for sea turtles, and remember, all state waters are in no discharge area. So please don't discharge. This is against the law. There's over 120 pump out, shoreside and mobile facilities. We've got tide charts with, the facilities on the backside, so use those.
That's great, Bruce. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything you're doing, Tori. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you found this show informative and enjoyable. I want to thank the staff and especially Dave at PAC TV for another great show. We'll see you next time on State Matters.